welcome to this edition of IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien. Today's discussion is focused on the many implications for our part of the world of the major war started by the US and Israel in the Middle East. Among other things, the events of the past month are yet another hammer blow to the transatlantic relationship and have served to emphasize Europe's weakness as a geopolitical actor capable of influencing global events in its own interests. The war has also strengthened Russia relative to Ukraine and runs the risk of further large-scale refugee flows into Europe. And then there's the economy. The costs of the conflict for Europe are already being felt in the shape of dramatic increases in energy prices, and governments across the continent are dipping into scarce fiscal resources to alleviate the impact for households and businesses. To discuss these and other issues, we're joined today by Riccardo Alcaro of Italy's Institute of International Affairs and author of Europe and Iran's Nuclear Crisis, by Laurence, who's the Brussels Deputy Bureau Chief for the Wall Street Journal and the paper's long-standing point person on Iranian nuclear issues, and by our own Loretta O'Sullivan, who's Chief Economist at EY Ireland and Joint Chair of the Economists Group here at IIEA. So with that, welcome to you all. Thanks for giving us your time. And maybe we'll start with Riccardo and some of your opening thoughts on matters of greatest relevance to Europe owing to this conflict.
Yes, first, thanks of all. Thank you very much, Dan, for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here, have this opportunity. So before I share my thoughts about the implications for Europe, let me just say where we are as far as I say it, and why this is going to impact whatever I'm going to say about implications for Europe. At the moment, the situation on the ground, the situation of the war seems to reflect a tension between structural material factors that, in theory, work as brakes on the war, the economic costs of the war, first and foremost, but also the depletion of military resources on both sides, especially, well, on the Israeli-American side, I'm talking especially about defensive capacities to intercept Iranian drones and missiles. So these two structural material factors push towards de-escalation and at least a downgrading of the intensity of the hostilities. But on the other side, you have political factors that push towards a likely escalation, especially in Israel and Iran. You have strong parties, perhaps dominant parties in both governments, believing that the time is not yet ripe for putting an end to the war, that their original goal was something similar, close to that, is achievable. For Israel, this would be, of course, the collapse of the Islamic regime, lacking that severe long-term weakening of the Iranian state that prevents Iran from re-emerging as a potential challenge to its regional, technological, and military superiority. On the Iranian side, you have now the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has basically apparently taken over the government entirely, and which is doing what it has been trained to do for many, many years, which is asymmetric warfare. And it is doing fairly well, according to their own standards. They, at least the kind of message they are projecting is that they believe that they can go on longer than the United States in this war. They can keep absorbing the immense damage the Israeli and US bombings are causing Iran, while continuing to raising the costs for everybody by externalizing the conflict to the region through both attacks on energy infrastructures and, of course, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, plus the additional damage to Israeli and especially US military installations in the area. In between, you have the Arab Gulf states, which I think are divided. You have countries such as Oman, Qatar, which probably still think that de-escalation is the best course of action, or the least worst course of action, because we are not talking about good options here, only bad and worse options. But then you have the Emirates and probably the Saudis too, who may have concluded that things have gone too far to go back, and so it is better to risk and absorb the costs of a prolonged war in order to get to a final better outcome than would have been the case if the war stops tomorrow. And the U.S. administration is a bit in between, is on the one hand very belligerent in its rhetoric, on the other hand very oscillating in the kind of objectives it has set out to achieving. But from the outside, if you abstract from a moment from Trump's words, which is what really confuses people most of all, you have the feeling that the US military machine is geared toward a continued engagement in a high intensity war against Iran for at least some weeks. Of course, we cannot be certain about that. You can never be certain with Trump, but this is the sense I get from what the administration and the military actually do, rather than if I focus on Trump's words. What are the implications for Europe? Well, you anticipated the implications for Europe very well. There are immense economic costs, which may become astronomical if the war keeps going for weeks or even months. And there is a serious problem of energy security supply, which becomes not only scarcer, but also harder to stabilize. You have the implications, the indirect implications on Russia and Ukraine, which are good for the former and not so good for the latter. And in general, a lack of attention and political investment in what remains Europe's main front. You have the risk, especially if Iran is at the end broken and the country is destabilized, prospects of massive migration flows which can reach European shores. And you have another transatlantic rift. Now Trump has something to point to say that European NATO allies are unreliable. They are not there when the United States needs them. I mean, regardless of the fact that it would be absurd for the Europeans to just engage in whatever military adventure the US president decides with no previous consultation or coordination. But this is the kind of narrative Trump is feeding, and so they also have to look after their long-term security interest in keeping the United States even under Trump engaging Europe for as much or for the little that is possible, not forgetting that Trump is going to be president for almost 3 more years. And if the rhythm with which crisis and geopolitical crisis have accumulated in the 13, 14 months he's been president continues, well, then 3 years is really, really a long time. So a lot on Europeans' plate.
Thank you, Riccardo. Just a follow-up in terms of the energy situation. I know Italy is particularly unusually dependent on Gulf gas. Are there fears in Italy that you might have actual shortages of energy? And also, have there been any contacts between Rome and Tehran on possibly allowing LNG tankers to leave the Gulf and come to Italy, leave without a threat?
There are widespread concerns about Italy's capacity to import the gas it needs. Of all European countries, Italy was, I think, the largest importer of Qatari LNG. So this is going to have a direct impact, but there is also, of course, the indirect impact in the sense that LNG is being sold at higher prices, and so this will cost Italy more. Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister, recently went to Algeria, which after Russia's invasion of Ukraine became Italy's largest provider of gas, to see what capacity there is, what residual capacity there is there to increase Algerian exports of gas towards Italy. I think there is a margin, but that would cover between 40 and 45%, if I'm not mistaken, of what Qatar's LNG covered until a few weeks ago. And in terms of contacts with Tehran, look, I do not have any information, and even if I had it, I would not share it. On the one hand, I would be glad if my government had been so, how can I say, so realistic and started sounding out the Iranians about whether there is a chance for ships going to Italy to get a pass in the Strait of Hormuz. On the other hand, I would also be concerned if the Italian government had done it, especially if it had done it without consulting with the Americans and other NATO allies and EU member states, because it would send a signal to the Iranians that they are winning the kind of war they are fighting, which I remark again is an asymmetric war. It's not the same kind of war that Israel and the United States are fighting.
Thank you, Riccardo. Laurence, can we go to you? I know as two people who have followed the Iranian nuclear issue for many years, you've sometimes had disagreements of opinion. So certainly not if those exist today, we don't shy away from those. Floor is yours, Laurence.
No. Disappointingly, no disagreements with Ricardo there. He set out a really great map of who's where and what's going on. I'd like to stick on the kind of the war side before we get into the Europe impact. I just have three quick points to make. I think number one, this is an unusual war in the sense that usually via CNN or whatever it is, we see very, very clearly what the Americans or America and its allies are doing in a war, the successes they're having, the impact they're having, good or bad during a war. That's not happening this time. We are seeing very, very clearly what Iran is doing. We are seeing what it's doing to the global economy. We're seeing what it's doing to its regional allies. We're seeing what it's doing in Israel, and we're seeing even what it's doing in Europe with Cyprus. So we have a great deal of knowledge about the impact that the Iranians are having, which has, I would agree with Ricardo, been pretty successful, maybe even more successful than some of those than some of us thought. But we don't really have a great insight into the extent to which Iran's military capacity has been degraded. The Americans say it has, but we don't know how much. We don't know how many missiles they have left. We don't know how many drones they have left. And we don't know the degree of chaos or non-communication or breakdown of command and control that's going on in Tehran. It seems not to have broken down, but we really don't have a clear picture. And I think that should be borne in mind as we look at what's going on and where it ends up. Point number two, we may well have talks in the next few days. The Iranians have not committed to them. The Americans seem pretty keen. They've both put out preconditions or demands which are totally incompatible. I mean, if they were incompatible in Geneva last month during talks, these are really, I mean, they couldn't be designed to be more incompatible. But the only thing that matters is the cost for the United States and the cost for Iran becoming unacceptably high? I don't know the answer to that. The Iranians, as Ricardo says, make it seem as if they can carry on going for months. Maybe, maybe not. But I would not exclude the possibility that those talks A happen, and I wouldn't exclude that they end up in some kind of minimalist deal because the pain is getting too high on both sides. So I wanted to make that point. I'm not predicting it, I just wouldn't exclude it. And third, I want to come to just to point on how we will eventually, whether it's next week or in 3 years' time, or in my children's lifetime, evaluate this war and come to a judgment about the impact. I think on the Iranian side, the critical question is, has their deterrence and their ability to deter their enemies, particularly America, maybe less so Israel, has their deterrence increased because of this war? Is the United States less likely to come back because of the costs Iran has shown it's been able to incur? Which would be to re-establish some deterrence that Iran had basically lost last June. And on the flip side, how long will it take for the Americans? How long will it take Iran to rebuild its military capabilities? It is often the case that we think that, when one side has been pummeled, um, by the US, by the Russians against Ukraine, whoever, that that's going to be a lasting impact. It really is. So how long will it take? Months, years, decades for Iran to re-establish its missiles, its drones, its military offensive threat that going beyond its ability to disrupt? So those are the 3 points I wanted to make.
Great. Thank you for that, Laurence. Loretta, on the economics of it, what are your thoughts?
Okay, and thanks, Dan, for having me, and hello to everybody. From a macroeconomic perspective, I suppose what we can say with this, the conflict is evolving, and that makes it difficult to predict and to have a sense of we are not so clear on where it's going to go. What we do know is that it's roiling global energy markets. It does pose risks for supply chains. It poses risks in terms of inflation. It poses risks in terms of economic activity. What we're seeing at the moment is disruption to the Gulf energy supply, so oil and gas, the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz. That is significant. I mean, it is a vital artery in terms of global trade, and we've got about a quarter of global seaborne crude oil flowing through it, and about a fifth of global liquefied natural gas. And much of that gas going to Asia and to Europe, so significant in that respect for this part of the world. We also have rising risks around oil production, around the refining capacity, around the LNG infrastructure. So all of this is lifting energy prices. It is fueling market volatility. It is leading to a gradual tightening in financial market conditions. Forecasters, as you said at the outset, they're adjusting their forecasts. Their numbers at the moment are going in the direction that people would expect. So there's generally a lowering of projections for GDP growth and a raising of projections for inflation. But I will say, and every forecaster is going to say this, is that there is a huge uncertainty around where the conflict is going, around the macroeconomic consequences. So if it is short-lived, if this uptick in energy prices that we've seen, if that reverses later this year, our own simulations and modelling work in EY would say for the euro area that the hit to growth is modest enough that impact on inflation is temporary. So to give you some numbers on that, we have revised down growth forecasts from about 1.3 pre-conflict to 1 now. So it's about a quarter of a percentage point hit or so. And in terms of inflation, we've added about a half a percentage point to inflation forecasts, which would take the euro area inflation rate, the headline rate, up to about 2.4%. So above the ECB's target, it would come down below that next year. The impact on specific countries and within the euro area when it comes to inflation is going to differ depending on a couple of things, depending on the weight of energy in the consumption basket, on the mix of fossil fuels within that, and also on the impact, on the extent to which there's, regulatory factors at play, and they allow for a quicker or slower pass through of developments in wholesale markets into consumer prices. So that's kind of the story around, if it's a short-lived conflict and if there's some reversal in energy prices. The fallout, obviously, from a macro perspective is going to be much greater if the conflict is more prolonged and if the energy shock ends up being bigger. So we've done a severe scenario on that where we'd have oil prices, climbing to around 110, staying above $100 per barrel through year end. In that situation, bigger hit to GDP growth. And a bigger hit then in terms of inflation, so potentially adding about 2 percentage points to inflation. So that compares with kind of a 0.5 percentage point in a moderate scenario, short-lived, about 2 percentage points in a more severe scenario. So you can see there is a difference there. Key for all of this then is just the duration of the shock, the magnitude of the shock. That's what economists are looking at, trying to think about and trying to model. That's also very relevant for policymakers, for what governments are going to do and handle this, and for what central banks are going to do as well.
Right. Thanks, Loretta. Just worth saying to the audience that Loretta's EY's forecast figures are 0.3 of a percentage point off GDP and 0.5 percentage point on inflation, broadly reflect any other forecasts that I've seen. And I would note there's a difference between economists that actually put numbers into models and those who don't, in terms of how serious this is at this point. Of course, as Loretta said, if it goes on for longer and gets much worse, then the economic implications will be worse. But to some extent, there's been something, in my view, approaching an excessive sort of panic around the economic implications of this at this point. So I think EY's and Loretta's forecasts are reflective of how economic forecasters are looking at this. Great. Laurence, maybe come to you first as arguably the person closest to events, given your journalistic role. How would you assess the conflict so far, the implications of the conflict so far for how Europe does things, its cohesion and capacity to act in a united way? And does, if the answer to that is not particularly good, does this just highlight Europe's lack of geopolitical clout?
Oddly, I would say the cohesion has been quite good, but it doesn't change the lack of economic clout, the lack of geopolitical clout. I mean, you have a situation in Europe where most governments agree with each other on this, and that is the cohesion. And the cohesion is not is not something that's been come up with a particularly strategic discussion among European Union leaders or foreign ministers. They just kind of agree, most of them. This is not our war. This wasn't a great idea, at least the way it's been done, the timing, the reasons it was done for. And there are consequences for us. There are things we need to deal with, but we're not going to slot into the US camp. And when you have the UK basically saying this, then you have quite an extraordinary level of cohesion that we actually haven't seen on many other issues. Even the Hungarians, I think, are broadly in the same camp of the rest of Europe. But it's a cohesion that is not produced by being in the same continent or being in the European Union. It's a cohesion that has come about from the bottom up because they largely agree on the situation. Does it, however, suggest that Europe is getting its act together? Well, on one level, yes. I think if last year was the year of Europe's humiliation, this year has been the year of pushback. And we saw that with Greenland, and we've seen it with Iran. And again, Trump is being pretty rude to a bunch of people, including Keir Starmer. And they've taken it and they've pushed back, and they haven't really changed policy. So I think that there is, in that sense, something positive that European leaders can take from it. But are they driving events? No. Are they impacted by events? Yes. Even if they were wanting to get involved, do they have the military assets to make a big difference? No. So all of those basic structural, why are we so irrelevant these days, problems still exist. But it's another example where Trump wants one thing, we don't agree, and actually by standing together, talking to each other, and pushing back, we have stood our ground.
Riccardo, the similar question from your perspective in Rome, do you think the European countries, not just, as Laurence says, not just the EU countries, but European countries share the same analysis of the risks and threats posed to their interest by the war? And also specifically, you've mentioned to me before that Meloni has always been very careful not to criticize Trump in public. Has that changed over the past month at all?
So briefly, yes and no. Yes, to your first question, I think that by and large, European governments share the same very common sense analysis that it is much better for them now, if only for the total unpredictability of how the war will unfold. It is much better for them not to get involved militarily and make them and turn themselves into co-belligerents in a war they did not plan, they did not want, and they are getting no advantage from. It is a baseline, however, not really a strategy. But with Trump and on Iran, for different reasons, which, however, are very much related to one another, the Europeans had finally ended up in a place, some would say rightly, some others, including me, not that wisely, in which they had very little agency or no agency at all, if not as a supporter of a US action, especially if that action had been a diplomatic action, but the US did not involve them in the diplomacy or the image of diplomacy, the show of diplomacy it put up with Iran before last year's Israel's attack and the subsequent 12-day war, and before the February 28 Israeli-American attack on Iran. I think the Europeans stopped or gradually saw their geopolitical clout over Iran and in the region dissipate as long as the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the 2015 nuclear deal, which the Europeans have been really instrumental in facilitating and was struck by the Obama administration alongside France, Germany, the UK, Russia, China, plus the EU. So that instrument, that was the platform upon which they could still wield some geopolitical clout, because they could influence, by supporting it or by defending it, the choices of both Iran and the United States. They managed to do that for a long while, especially before the deal was struck. But even after Trump pulled the United States out of the deal in 2018 unilaterally, with no coordination, and according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, when Iran was largely in compliance with the deal. So even after that, they still managed to influence the choices of both countries, but then it became impossible for them, because they never found a way to push back against US secondary sanctions, which, as I guess most people know, have an extraterritorial reach. And they never found the political courage, or they never believed it was really in their interest to challenge forcefully the United States on an issue such as Iran, which they still saw as basically a threat to be managed and contained, and only gradually, perhaps solved. So once the JCPOA died, and it was a long and slow process, but it eventually died entirely. The Europeans really had no room left for having any say. They had, in the meantime, also radicalized on Iran because of what Iran's government did thrice in the last 7 years to its own population, 2019, and then especially 2022 and 2026. So the public debate on Iran in Europe became toxic, to an extent even more toxic than it was in the United States, I mean, I've been following the issue for many, many years, and the tone of the debate in Europe on Iran in the last year reminded me of how in the United States Iran was talked before Trump pulled the US out of the nuclear deal. A last word on Meloni. Meloni has made a point in never criticizing Trump. She has kept to the point on tariffs, on Ukraine, on NATO, on American demands for impossibly high military spending threshold imposed on Europeans, on the very imbalanced trade deal struck in July last year, on Greenland, and even on Iran. She has explicitly said, I do not condemn nor endorse this war. And this has always been her line. And look, Meloni's relationship with Trump, and especially with the US national conservatism, so right-wing conservatism, is based more on politics than on policies. And there is this ideological alignment. They share a view of Western civilization as a community based on tradition, Christian religion, a cultural homogeneity, and even ethnic homogeneity. And there is an element of pragmatism on the part of Meloni. And this is actually common sense pragmatism. The United States is the most powerful country in the world, is Italy's most important security provider, and second largest trade partner. So as an Italian, I would expect my prime minister to try to be on good terms with the US president. However, the proximity to Trump has gradually become a handicap. This past weekend, actually this past Monday, Meloni came out losing out of a very important here in Italy referendum campaign, which has rejected constitutional reform of the judiciary, which she and her government had pushed very, very hard for. So she has suffered the heaviest setback in her political career since she became prime minister, of course. And I would say that the Iran war and its implications, and the fact that Meloni was associated with Trump, must have played a role in mobilizing people who were really willing to give a message to Meloni. We do not support your position. We do not think that what you're doing with the US administration is good, not least because we have not gotten any real advantage, no tariff exception, etc.
So that was exactly the question. There's nothing, for all of the proximity politically, it hasn't delivered any tangible benefits for Italy to be so close to the US, from what you're saying.
Well, there was an investigation by the Department of Commerce started last year on Italian pasta exports to the United States, which had people here in Italy really fretting and freaking out, because at least pasta producers, because it could have resulted in 107% tariffs on Italian pasta, but luckily, or perhaps because of Meloni's proximity to the Trump administration, the investigation was closed with no additional tariff. But you see, Dan, is really little stuff. I think that Meloni still sees, well, let's see what happens depending on how long the war continues. I think that so far Meloni and the US national conservatives have always concluded that it was in their interest to cultivate the relationship because of the reciprocal legitimation that their common ideological framework, and especially civilizational framework of what a West is, provide them with. Now the policy part is, at least for as much as Meloni is concerned, is prevailing over the politics dimension of the relationship. And if the war goes on and she enters the electoral season, I mean, we are supposed to go to election at the latest in 2027, and Italy enters electoral season on the verge of or already in recession, well, then the Trump factor will have proven to be, as it apparently did already during the referendum, not just an electoral handicap, but an albatross across Meloni's neck.
Okay. Laurence, did you want to jump in on something?
Just to make a very brief point, you can't tell the story of Iran's souring relationship with Europe without mentioning Iran's support for Russia against Ukraine. I really think, I think you mentioned it at the beginning, Dan. I really think that's critical.
Absolutely, absolutely. Loretta, difficult question, and you may not it may not be able to have a good answer for it. But is there a point with energy prices that you think would be the tipping point to bring a recession to Europe? And also more broadly, maybe on a more positive one, the number of shocks the European economy and global economy has faced this decade between the pandemic and lockdowns and interest rates and inflation, a war, an energy shock from the Russia crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, tariffs. Yet the European economy has not contracted. I would have thought it'd be in a depression with shocks like that. Is it possible that there's much more resilience in the economy than we think, and will come through even this latest shock?
Yeah, I think difficult to say if there's a tipping point as such in terms of energy prices, and partly because there's much more to the shock than energy prices. So a lot of the simulations and the modeling that's done and the ECB scenarios last week that you would have referenced before, showing a reduction in growth and a weakness, but not catastrophic as such. So if you do look behind those numbers, you do see on a quarterly basis, on the quarterly profile, there is some weakness in the numbers. But there's caveats around that, and there's more going on. So we have to think a little bit too about what might the impact of disruptions to the distribution and the logistics and transit around fertilizer, around sulfur, around aluminium, what that might mean. So could there be supply bottlenecks and disruption to non-energy sectors of the economy, which would have implications? Those scenarios that are done too typically don't change monetary policy from what's in the baseline. So in a situation where we had the central bank, for example, if the ECB were to act very aggressively, that would clearly have an impact on the economy. It would lead to higher borrowing costs. It would impact consumer spending decisions. It would impact investment. So that kind of effect would need to be taken into account as well. So I think what we're dealing with here is quite a multi-dimensional shock beyond energy, and that makes it more difficult to just pull out one number. We have to think of it in the round. But as you very rightly say, if we look back over the last number of years, in the last decade or so, I'm not old enough to remember the oil crisis of the 1970s, but I do remember for sure the global financial crisis, the pandemic, the Brexit piece, the war in Ukraine, and so on. And the European economy has come through those well, and indeed the Irish economy has come through those well. So there has been a resilience built up as well.
Thanks for that. Laurence, coming to you, and only sort of partially related to the conflict, but more a transatlantic relations question. The issue of using the anti-coercion instrument the EU put together, the so-called Big Bazooka. Clearly, Europe has not deployed that and has thought that they didn't want to escalate conflict with the US. You might talk us through some of your perspectives on the balance of positions amongst the 27 on that, and whether you think it might be used. I'm thinking in particular, the Trump administration has threatened Spain with specific tariffs. What do you think would happen if one country was singled out for tariffs? Would you think that might trigger the deployment of the anti-coercion instrument?
I'll give you a very cheeky answer first. I think there might be one or two countries in Europe who wouldn't mind it being a bit of trade abuse against Spain. I think Chancellor Merz was not loquacious in his defense of Spain in the White House. Look, the caveat that I'm not an expert on trade, I do think that the moment where it was seriously under consideration was Greenland. And I think that whatever the fissures consequences of the latest disagreement with the White House over Iran, they pale into comparison compared with the degree of shock and panic that was around Greenland at the turn of the year. Now, look, if the US does target Spain, I think it would be very difficult not to respond with something like the anti-coercion instrument. I mean, there is just a basic level of political solidarity that would make it difficult. And Trump talks a lot. Frequently, he doesn't follow through. And I think there would be enough US opposition and commercial business opposition to trying to do that. But I won't, yeah, I'd be reluctant to make a guess on the response because it's not deeply my area. I do, however, think, I mean, if Greenland comes back, if there is a direct threat to the sovereignty and territory of the EU and NATO, I mean, they were definitely ready to do something on that front. But at the end of the day, it's the United States. It wouldn't surprise me if it's used against China before it is ever used against the United States.
Right. Okay. Interesting point. And on the Greenland question, do you see, of course, anything is possible with this administration, but are you hearing anything in terms of it still rumbling on, or do you think
I think you answered your own question, Dan. Anything is possible with this US administration. The latest seems to be they are in talks. Those talks seem to be aimed at doable, achievable things. But whether those talks are happening at officials level and bumbling on relatively successfully, but haven't reached the White House, I don't know. And when they do reach the White House, anyone's guess.
Thanks. Okay, so both to you, Laurence, and Riccardo, you guys are two of the most knowledgeable people and have followed the Iran question, nuclear question, for so long. What's your assessment of how close they were to acquiring a workable nuclear weapon, either before the attacks last summer, before the current attacks, and generally in terms of their whole infrastructure around a nuclear capability? How advanced is it? How close were they? Riccardo, do you want to take that briefly?
You're on mute, Riccardo.
You're still on mute there, Riccardo.
My apologies. I think this may be one of those issues on which Laurence and I are gonna disagree. I do not think that Iran was anything near a nuclear weapon capacity before June 2025. So when Israel attacked it, when a sixth round of negotiations between American and Iranian representatives had already been scheduled in Muscat, in Oman. This said, after the United States left the nuclear deal, Iran started incrementally to revise its options, and eventually got to the point in which it was willing to use a greater potential capacity to create the fuel needed for nuclear weapons as first a bargaining chip, and failing that, perhaps a nuclear weapon indeed. But the decision was never taken, and diplomacy on the nuclear front was always the first choice. I have followed the Iranian nuclear issue since 2004-5, so basically since the beginning. And I am really persuaded that Iran's nuclear choices have always been made based on the set of incentives and disincentives it was given, or better, incentives and pressure it was given. And only when the two things were used wisely in combination, you had a result. You had a positive response from Iran. And that was in the early 2010s, and culminating in 2015 with the nuclear deal. So I've read a lot of criticisms about the nuclear deal, and I've never been convinced that the criticisms was strong enough to make the nuclear deal a bad thing. In fact, the nuclear deal was, and in my opinion, remains a masterful diplomatic achievement, which, in theory, had it been implemented in good faith for years, would have resulted in a greater possibility for Iran to transform itself. It would have strengthened.
Let me stop you there. We're just running out of time.
Yes.
Riccardo, Laurence, do you want to possibly have a different view on that? And also just bringing this forward, do you see the current attacks as actually increasing the incentive for whatever regime comes out of this in Tehran to move towards a nuclear weapon as the only way to prevent something like this happening again?
Yeah, so I mean, look, there's areas of agreement that I have with Ricardo on this, and there's areas of disagreement. I've never seen Iran's ambition on nuclear to be purely a bargaining chip. I think Ricardo does. I don't. But to go to your question, I think Iran absolutely had last June was within a few months, and that ranges anything from 2 to 6 months. And I've heard from people involved and following this, the ability to develop something that they probably did not want to develop, which was a nuclear missile that they were capable of delivering only by ship or by truck. And I don't think, well, we know for sure that that was not Iran's goal. They wanted missile deliverable nuclear weapons. And on that, I would agree with Ricardo that they were still some way from. I may think they were closer than he does, but there's every bit of evidence that they were at least a year away from what they really wanted. So I do think that they were relatively close. I think they've got most of the know-how. I think they can pretty much do it to actually building a weapon. But can they fit it on a missile and fire it? No. And really, quite honestly, I don't think there's a great deal of point of having a couple of nuclear weapons that they may not be able to deliver by land. And I think that is precisely the reason why Khamenei Senior stayed on the threshold. Now, in terms of the future, I think there is a real lesson for the new leadership, including his son, if he's alive or intact or whatever, which is the worst place to be, it turns out, is on the nuclear threshold, because you don't have the deterrence of the bomb and you have every reason for your enemies to attack you. And so so Iran has something to work out. What does it do? Does it give up on its nuclear program and say that's the safest way to be and that's how we get sanctions relief? Or does it go for it? Khamenei is dead. The fatwa is dead. The fatwa against weapons. I do worry that their decision will be, we've got to cross that threshold. And again, I think this is probably an area where Ricardo and agree. Yes, they have highly enriched uranium. They have centrifuges. They allegedly have a new enrichment facility, although I'm pretty skeptical it's anywhere near ready. The risks of being caught and the degree of penetration of the regime in general, but particularly in the nuclear program by the Israelis and the Americans, is so deep that they're really going to struggle to build a nuclear weapon, even a truck deliverable nuclear weapon in the foreseeable future. Everything is being watched. Everyone involved has been identified. I think it's going to be tough for them. And certainly I would agree with Ricardo, the way that the Trump administration has talked about the nuclear threat, I think, frankly, is completely for the birds.
Okay, thank you. Loretta, interest rates. How do you think the European Central Bank is going to respond to? There's clearly going to be an uptick in inflation. I personally don't think it's going to be as big as many people fear, but I think your figures are pretty good. It could go higher, of course, but generally speaking, compared to the last first inflation shock we had in 40 years in 21 and 22, ECB was slow to react, as many central banks were. There's some thinking that it's a smaller shock this time. It's not pandemic related this time. It's just an energy shock, which we've had quite a few times over the past 40 years. So they may look through it, as they say in the economics jargon, or they may feel that workers were slow because of the long period of low inflation, workers were slow to seek pay increases. This time, people are much more alive to the possibility of a real return to inflation. Therefore, wages could rise more quickly, and the ECB will want to anchor, as they say in the jargon, inflation expectations. Do you think they'll look through it this time, or do you think they'll act more aggressively than last time?
Okay, for now, they're on hold, and they stood pat at March's meeting, and that was as expected. I think that could change, and part of why that could change is will be determined by what's happening in terms of second round effects. And they will be looking very closely at indicators like inflation expectations that you were talking to there, like wage trackers, to see if there is significant movement in that respect. I mean, we've heard them talk hawkish. Again, we'd expect that because they are trying to anchor those inflation expectations. If the shock is short-lived, the oil prices reverse and so on, as we were discussing earlier there, they may not react. They may do an element of talking hawkish, but ultimately look through and not react. If it is more prolonged, we have a situation where it becomes more challenging then, because there is a growth and inflation trade-off. If they hike, it will be damaging for growth, but they will want to hike because they will want to curb inflation. So there's that piece around the opposing forces of growth and inflation. The ECB, obviously, their mandate is around inflation. I think it's fair point to make that the memory of the pandemic reopening of economies, the supply chain pressures that were there at that time, the Ukrainian war and the upward pressure that put in terms of inflation, that is all very fresh in their minds. So, in that situation, we do think that they will act, and we do think that the direction of travel will be more likely up than down. So, something maybe a 0.5 percentage point hike or so. I mean, markets are putting in lots of things at the moment. They're going in, they're coming out as the news is changing on a regular basis. But maybe if we're looking at that kind of more prolonged shock, I think they will lean more towards reacting and hiking, but maybe not quite as aggressively as people are thinking.
Okay, that's great. Laurence and Riccardo, interested in your views on this one. If the US stops its attacks on Iran, but Israel continues, and the result of that is continued elevated energy prices, oil, gas, other things not getting out of the Gulf, how do you think the Europeans will react? Do you think there's a possibility they would use economic pressure on Israel to stop the attacks in order to stop the economic implications? Laurence first.
I don't think it's going to happen. I think there's more chance that the Iranians will continue to block the Strait of Hormuz and therefore continue the situation. Even if the Americans don't want to fight, then the Israelis carry on fighting without the Americans. There's just some basic truths, and Riccardo touched on them. The Israelis require American help. They require American munitions. They require American interceptors. And I don't see a situation where America says and Trump says stop, and the Israelis, just carry on. I don't think it's their intention. Don't think it's going to happen. I do worry the Americans and the Israelis will stop, and the Iranians will keep causing trouble in the Strait of Hormuz. I may be wrong. If the Israelis do that, I think there is a lot of ill will towards Israel in a lot of countries. Whether the Hungarians, the Czechs, the Austrians, and the Germans will block economic sanctions as they did before, I don't know. But I really don't think we're going to get into that scenario.
Okay, interesting. Riccardo, what are your views?
I largely agree with regard to the war against Iran, but there is also Israel's offensive in Lebanon, which is against Hezbollah, so against Iran's main non-state ally in the region. And Israel is apparently willing to finish the job. It's believed it had basically finished during the offensive against Hezbollah in 2024. Hezbollah has proven to be more resilient than people expected, even militarily. It is less degraded than it was expected. and Israel just wants to, use the opportunity of this war and the fact that Iran is busy with defending itself, or basically defending itself by attacking others, for putting an end to the story of its enmity with Hezbollah. Problem is that the Israeli government is run by hardliners who think that this would be a good time to push the border de facto or even the jure to the Litani River, so to expand northwards Israel, and with all the humanitarian consequences associated with the land invasion. And on that front, you would see a lot of debate inside Europe. Perhaps Laurence is right, there will be no economic sanctions, but there will be a lot of debates about how far Israel should be allowed to go.
And just a final one, Laurence, I'm interested to know if you're hearing anything. Last weekend, the Iranians seem to have attempted to launch a missile as far as Diego Garcia, I think about 4,000 kilometers away. If that's the case, that would make Europe within range of Iranian missiles. Is that something that's resonated in Europe? Do you hear people talking about that? Is that a concern?
Riccardo and I could have had, if there weren't 3 minutes left, a good argument about Hezbollah. I will remind Riccardo and your audience that Hezbollah fired on Israel in the last couple of weeks, which was a pretty stupid thing to do. Leaving that aside, look, Iran has proven that it can hit Europe. It hit Cyprus, or it fired at Cyprus. We know that there are parts of Europe that Iran's missile capabilities have the ability to hit. It would be pretty surprising for them to do it and pretty stupid for them to do it. It's not something that I think will need to keep us awake at night. In terms of the missile that went to Diego Garcia, we're still trying to get to the bottom of it. Look, there are a couple of things we know about their missiles, right? In order to reach 4,000 kilometers, they almost certainly lightened the warhead on what it was. It wasn't, it was miles away. It was a very low security risk. They don't have the ability to project that range yet with any accuracy that makes it a real threat. But there is a space program in Iran in which they collaborate with the Russians and the North Koreans, and it is not a space program. It is a missile program. It is about perfecting the ability, improving the ability to fire at very long ranges. That is why they have it. And there are US estimates, DNI estimates, that come from the Biden administration that predict that Iran will have 60 ICBMs in 2035. It is not an imminent threat. It is not going to happen, to quote President Trump, soon, but there is no doubt they are working on it, and there is no doubt that in the medium term it's something to worry about for the US and for Europe. The US is developing missile defenses. Where are Europe's? Still, it's not my number one concern. I'd worry a lot more about what the Russians are able to fire, but they are working on this.
I'd like to really thank our guests for taking the time, an hour out of their busy days today, with so much going on in particular. So thank you for joining us. Thanks the audience for their attention as well. And we look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Have a good afternoon.